blessing of having Doug speak to us. And so I asked him earlier if he wanted a magnificent introduction, or if I could just say, here's Doug. So here's Doug.
Hey!
Thank you. Well, the microphone's working. That's a good start. I'm not quite used to this headset, so I was wondering how it worked, but we're okay here. I see it's a little flat here. Sorry. Well, it's good to be with you. I want to say how much I appreciate the worship here and the fact that it's Jesus-centered worship. Warms my heart. I know over the summer you've been doing the big stories of the Old Testament. You gotten all the way through the Old Testament yet?
Oh, yeah.
I know when I was here I was speaking on Famous Abe, one of my favorite characters. Today I want to speak on the big story of the Old Testament. You know, there's big stories in the Old Testament, but there is only really one big story. But before I get there, I want to tell a story. When I was a young guy in Whitehorse with Pam and Alf back in those days, our pastor was a storyteller. And it would drive me crazy sometimes listening to the stories over and over. You know, but the amazing thing was, he'd tell these stories and then people would get saved and get healed and marriages restored. And it turns out Jesus was a storyteller. So you're going to have to be patient with me while I tell a story about Alf. You'll like this. I don't know, hi Alf, I'm sure you're going to watch this on video. My apologies. You know, I don't know if you have particular words in your life that are kind of burned in your memory. Usually this happens through some significant event or more like trauma. I have a word. If you could put that word up for me. Ever seen this word before? It's because it's not really a word. It's actually Golf Oscar Uniform Papa. It was the call sign to Alf's airplane. Did you know Alf had an airplane at one time? Alf went through in with two other guys. We lived in the north, and it was very northern to have like plaid shirt, hiking boots, dogs, and kind of the pinnacle of being in the north was to get your pilot's license. You know, so Alf threw in with two guys. They bought this little airplane, a little Piper Cherokee. Actually, it was Charlie Golf Oscar Uniform Papa, because Canadian planes will have a C at the front. But anyways, Alf got his pilot's license, and I used to go flying with Alf, which led to some really interesting adventures. And one year, near the end of February, I quit my job, and Alf wasn't working, and he says to me, "Hey, why don't we fly to Edmonton and visit my sister?" I said, "Oh, okay." Because, we were young and dumb. And so Alf at that point had about 90 hours flying time under his belt. So he was really experienced. And it was about 10 hours to Edmonton flying time and about 10 hours back. It was a number of years later, I was reading an article about private airplane crashes, and they had a graph that, measured crashes versus hours of piloting experience. And the graph went like this. It started at 0 and went like this to a high point and then went down. And you know where that high point was? 100 hours. And the point of the article was at 100 hours, you've got just enough knowledge to get yourself killed. So we decided to go winter flying. Now, if you're not familiar with the Yukon is like BC. It's big mountain ranges with valleys, only way colder. So we were going to take this flight to Edmonton, which only crossed 3 mountain ranges, including the Rocky Mountains, in the middle of winter. In the days when, this is before we had the satellite coverage and before GPS, and weather stations were about 300 miles apart, and winter weather in the mountains, of course, changes very rapidly. So really the only accurate weather forecast you're ever going to get is from a plane going the other way, of which there was hardly any that time of year. What could go wrong? What could go wrong? I entitled this Aviation Adventures with Elf. This is just one part of our trip I wanted to share with you. And it actually has bearing on what I'm going to talk about today, so you just have to be patient. We left Whitehorse in winter weather, what they call VFR, visual flight rules, which I remember, I think was, you had to have 500 feet before you hit the clouds and could see, I can't remember if it was 2 miles or 5 miles. So we were just barely within VFR. We left Whitehorse, and of course navigation meant following the Alaska Highway, which was really great until the high points where you went over the mountains. And, if I told you all of the story, you wouldn't believe it. You'd think it was the plot from the movie Dumb and Dumber. I can laugh about this now. Anyways, we had one narrow escape. We made it to Watson Lake, and we landed at the airport there, and we refueled, and we filed a flight plan. And then we left for Fort Nelson, the next leg of our journey, in the afternoon. And we followed the Alaska Highway, which follows the Liard River down to Liard River Hot Springs, which is a great place to go swimming and meet black bears. At that point, the Alaska Highway departs Liard River and climbs to the highest part of the Rocky Mountains in that part of the world. Goes up through Munchell Lake, Summit, Steamboat Mountain. And of course, as we approached the river, we could see the highway disappearing into the clouds. So that's not going to work. And, instead of saying, gee, maybe we better land, or gee, maybe we should turn around and go back, Alf's flying, I'm navigating, and you don't want somebody with ADHD being your navigator. Partly because it never occurs to somebody with ADHD that maybe you should quit. There's always got to be a way. So I said to Alf, well, it makes sense. Rivers are in the low part, right? They don't go up, they're low. So if we follow the river, we can follow, there's the map. See, the Liard Hot Springs is kind of in the middle there. We'll just follow that blue line, sort of up as it goes up, and then eventually it hits that junction with the Fort Nelson River, and we can follow that down around and come into Fort Nelson from the northeast. That won't be a problem, because once we get through, partway down the Fort Nelson River, the mountains will be on one side and will be flat on the other. So we're merrily, flying along the Liard River. You can see it winding and twisting, and it's quite spectacular. You go through the Grand Canyon of the Liard River, and it's February, so it's cold, everything's frozen. And we're in this one part of the river where there's columns of water in the air and waves actually frozen in midair. And I'm looking at the map, and it says, I said, hey, cool, this is the Rapids of the Damned. Now, it's really noisy in a small plane, so you're wearing headphones and a microphone so you can talk to each other. Because if we weren't wearing the headphones, we would have heard the ominous music playing in the background, like in a movie, like something bad is going to happen. So, we're flying along, and we get to the junction of the river, and we say, okay, let's turn right. Well, we thought we were at the junction of the river. So we turn right, we're following the river. Now, you have to understand that at that time of the year, the river is frozen and it's white. Just like everything else, frozen and white. But it's the low spot, and okay, so we're following this. And I'm following the map, and we've been flying for a little while, and I said, Alf, the map says it's supposed to be high mountains on the right and flat land on the left. But we got high mountains on the right and high mountains on the left. I think something's wrong. We were truly and royally lost. And the light is starting to fail, and in that country where they have a lot of gas and oil exploration, there's seismic cut lines, everything in squares, and everywhere in squares, and you think, well, this would help you, but actually it makes everything look the same. And we're kind of on the borderline verge of panic. You have to understand that this area around Fort Nelson, in the days before GPS, was like the Bermuda Triangle of the North. Every year, you lose 5, 6 planes would just disappear in this area. And that was in the summertime, when the weather was good. We're in winter, and the weather's terrible, and we're in this, and we don't know where we are. We're flying along. Finally, I spot this dirt trail down below us. I said, "Oh, let's follow that dirt road. Maybe it's a logging road or an exploration road or something. It's got to go somewhere." Because there's no place to land. I mean, we're in trouble, and we're actually in so much trouble that we realized we were in trouble. If you heard the rest of the story, you'd understand that we were really in trouble. And so we're following this road. Now, we were supposed to come into Fort Nelson from the northeast. That little dirt trail we were following, we found out eventually, actually was the Alaska Highway. And instead of coming into Fort Nelson from the northeast, we ended up about somewhere 50, 60 miles to the west of Fort Nelson. That's how far off track we were. And so we're following this road, and eventually, just kind of in the last little bit, we realized, oh, this is the Alaska Highway. And we're watching down below. Just as we approach Fort Nelson, the clouds go whoop, down to the ground, and heavy snow starts falling, and it gets dark. Now, when you are below VFR and you come to an airport, you can't land. In those little airports where they don't have air control towers, or traffic control towers, they have a radio room. And these guys, there was about 4 or 5 of us that were trapped out there because it fell so suddenly. And we had to sit out there and wait while they would phone Edmonton Tower for permission for us to land. Like they're going to deny permission. No, you can't land here. You're just going to have to crash somewhere. And so we sat there and we waited our turn. Meanwhile, it's getting dark and it's snowing so heavily. Al's got the plane in a tight bank, and we're doing circles trying to keep the traffic light, the street lights in sight below us. And eventually, we landed.
Yes.
I noticed on this trip, every time we landed and we'd go into the radio room to talk to the guys and file a flight plan, they were always tense and jumpy, and they yelled a lot. And I thought, boy, these guys are really stressed out. When I look back on it now, I think we might have been the source of that stress. I'm not exaggerating, but this is what happened. But see, I'm a map guy. I love maps. Everywhere I go, I study the maps. I use GPS, but that's only so I know exactly where I am on the map, right here. So not everybody does well with maps. A lot of people have difficulty with maps. I talk to people sometimes, they can't find out, they don't know where they are, and they pull out a map and it's upside down, and they just don't relate. But, the problem with a map is you have to know 2 things about a map. One is you have to know where you are right now and where you're going. Then the map is helpful. Our problem when we were flying is we had a great map, we just didn't know where we were. And confusion comes in our life when we go off the map, or we can't read the map, or the map doesn't make any sense to us. And finally, I come to the point of what I want to talk about this morning. The big story of the Old Testament. See, the Old Testament is like a very large map. I think it's unfortunate that sometimes the Old Testament is in the front of the Bible instead of in the back. So people become Christians, the first thing we do is we say, read the Bible, so they start reading in Genesis. And by the time they get to Exodus, they're done. Like, it's over. Because they don't know where they are. They don't know where they're going. And it leads... I'm a big fan of reading the Bible, and I love the Bible, and I love all the stories. But you know, if we spend all of our time in the Old Testament without really understanding what the Old Testament is truly about, we end up in all kinds of confusion. Legalism and works. We were told, well, it's like the Old Testament is like a handbook for how to live. You know, it isn't really. 1 Corinthians 10, you know what it tells us here? 1 Corinthians 10 says, I want you to know, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea and all were baptized into Moses into the cloud and the sea and all ate the same spiritual food and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. So he's relating the stories of the Old Testament and saying it was really about Jesus. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now, these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. And he goes on to talk about idolatry and sexual immorality and grumbling and complaining. Verse 11, now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. You see, often the story of the Old Testament is not an example of how to live, it's an example of how we should live. What happens when we go off track? When we get caught up in the details, and you get the legalism and the works, you know, and just the strange ideas that flow. Well, I'm going to take all the principles of the Old Testament and apply them to my life, and now I'm going to be fabulously wealthy because all the promises of the Old Testament are mine. The prosperity gospel is strictly Old Testament stuff. Or we get this thing with, well, you know, all your problems in life would be solved if you just went to church on the right day, which is Saturday. Do you ever have people tell you that? It's just wonky stuff. And you get people in Christians who get caught up in this idea, well, we really have to become Jews now. And if we're really zealous Jews, we'll move to Israel. And I'm like, this is the Old Testament without Jesus. And it leads us into weird and strange places. Now, when we were young people in church, you learn to pay very close attention to the announcements. And this is why. During the announcements, they might announce that you have a new job. It was a different kind of leadership model than we're used to today. But I was listening during the announcements one day, and I found out that I've just been appointed the new Sunday school superintendent. Not married, don't have kids, never went to Sunday school really as a kid. No clue how to do it, right? But I knew Jesus, so I decided, well, I'm going to take a look at the Sunday school material and see what they're teaching. And it was, you know, the prepackaged stuff that you buy, and, you know, it's good. And I saw all these great stories about the Old Testament, and I read through all this stuff, but I only had one question. Where's Jesus? I couldn't find Jesus anywhere in the Sunday school material. I think there was one quarter every 2 years that they talked about Jesus. But they were teaching all these Old Testament stories, and if you were raised in church, you know what I mean. You knew all the stories of the Old Testament, but you didn't necessarily know Jesus very well. So I started to search to find Sunday school material that would point to Jesus. It was really hard. I looked for a long time. Because you see, Jesus is the big story of the Old Testament. Jesus is what it's all about. Now, in order for a book of what we call our Bible to be part of the Hebrew canon, the Jews would say it would have to speak of the Messiah that was coming. Somewhere, somehow in there would have to be a picture that would point to the coming Messiah. That's why, you know, if you were raised Catholic, you have some books in the Bible that aren't in our Bible, and they're called the Apocrypha. And those books actually fail at this test. They don't point to the coming of the Messiah. They've got some interesting stuff and some good history in them, and there's some goofy things in there, but they don't point to Jesus. But all through the Old Testament, if you're looking, if you're being sensitive, you will see that they're pointing forward to Jesus. So I love the story of Abraham that I talked about when I was here last month. You see, it's not the story of a son being born to a man and a woman who couldn't have children until their extreme old age. But it was the beginning of the fulfillment of a promise of one who was to come, in whom all the nations of all the families of the earth would be blessed. And that's Jesus. In Isaiah 9, verse 6, we read this at Christmas time, which is a shame. We should read it more often. For unto us a child is born. To us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. See, that's the old pointing to the new. See, this is where the stories of the Old Testament, like there's some good practical stuff. Don't melt down your gold jewelry and build a golden calf. It's not going to turn out well. You know, there's good practical wisdom in the book of Proverbs. But there's some of the stuff that's, I've seen people build entire systems on this stuff. And they forget about Jesus. We develop, when we focus so much on the Old Testament without Jesus, we develop Martha syndrome. Mary got it. And she was sitting at the feet of Jesus. Martha was every pastor's dream as a church volunteer. She's working away in the kitchen, and she's doing all these things that are needful and good and need to happen, and we're so grateful for them. But she's working away in the kitchen and growing in resentment because she's focused on the stuff and not on the reason, Jesus. Galatians chapter 4 says this, verse 1. I mean that the heir, as long as he is a child, is no different from a slave, though he is the owner of everything. He's talking here about being children of promise, but when we're children, we're basically under control, and that we're being instructed. But he is under guardians and managers until the date set by his father. In the same way, also, we were children, were enslaved to the elementary principles of the world, or to the law. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir through God. You see, the whole point of the Old Testament story was to bring us to a place when Jesus would come, to show us that we couldn't do it on our own, that we would fail if we thought we could make ourselves good enough for God, even if we built tight religious systems. See, I have a theory that we all have a religious spirit within us, and it loves rules. Don't tell me to seek God, just give me a list of do's and don'ts so I can check them off. There's a religious spirit that loves law. But it's not about the law. It's about showing us how much we need Jesus. Because if you've ever tried to follow the law, you will find out that you're going to crash and burn. The Old Testament goes on, in 1 Corinthians 10, talking about these examples and everything. And he says, There is no temptation overtaking that is not common to man. God has given us a way of escape. It's Jesus. And if I told you the whole story about that flight to Edmonton and back, time and time again, it wouldn't be a story really about two stupid guys, but about the amazing mercy and love of God that rescued us from crashing and burning. You know, we didn't talk about this trip for a long time to our lives. We came home. How was your trip? Oh, it was fine. Did you have any problems? Oh, no, it was good. It was years before Al told, maybe you haven't told Pam. Oh, the mercy of God. I look back on it now and I think, my, oh my. It's so easy for us to get caught up in the stories and to miss Jesus. We just had our 13th grandchild, hallelujah. When our first grandchildren came along, we wanted to get them like a story Bible. And we came across a book that had just recently been published. If you could put up that slide there. It's the Jesus Storybook Bible. Has anybody ever read that? You know it, eh? The byline is every story whispers his name. If you have grandchildren or children, you have a great excuse to go buy this Bible and read it for yourself. If you don't have any, just buy one and tell people you're going to read it to kids and you need to read this Bible. You know, it's Bible stories meant for beautiful artwork in it, but the stories, every one of those Old Testament stories draws you back to the story of Jesus. Now, I've been called a lot of things in my life. Some of them were even nice. But one label that nobody would ever apply to me is emotional. I'm not emotional. But, I pulled this out yesterday. I was reading it. I cannot read this children's storybook Bible without crying. The sweet presence of Jesus. The love of the Father. If you do the next slide there. All through the Old Testament, God would love his children with a never stopping, never giving up, unbreaking, always and forever love. See, the big story of the Old Testament isn't about Moses and the children of Israel in the wilderness and the promised land. It's about the love of a heavenly Father who never gives up and who sends his Son as love in the flesh to do for us what we could not do for ourselves. And when we have that in our heart, we can go back now and read the Old Testament. And we can read the stories, and we say, boy, were they ever dumb. Like two guys I know. Boy, were they ever dumb. That comes with hindsight. And with knowing where the story's going. And where our destination is in Jesus. And of the unfailing love of our Heavenly Father.
That's right.
I just want to, I'm ahead of time here. I just want to end with this thought. Every life tells a story. We have multiple stories, but in all of our lives, we're pointing in a direction. There comes a moment in our lives when we realize the direction we're pointing, we don't want to go there. We know how that story ends. And we turn around, we start going in the direction of God, and turning around is what the Bible calls repent. And turn around, going a different way, we're writing a different story. I want us to just take a moment. Just ask God, what story is my life telling right now? Which way is it pointing? Am I going to crash and burn, lost in the mountains? Am I going to find my place in Jesus, the love of the Father? See, wherever you are right now, whatever you're dealing with, and whether it's the big story of your life or all the little stories that make up that big story, there's this opportunity to focus on Jesus, the love of the Father. Lord, I want a different ending to this story. Maybe it's in some of your relationships that have crashed and burned. Maybe some of the attitudes of the heart. The places where you're feeling lost. Find Jesus and focus on that. Because God created us and has loved us and made a way for us. That every one of us, our story, can whisper his name. And we can be a sign pointing people towards Jesus. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 1 says, "Therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God." Paul talks about that in Corinthians, how that our lives are like a fragrant offering and sacrifice as we follow Jesus. We just stand together and pray as we close here this morning. Father, I'm reminded again of how much you love us. And despite the way we live, despite our stupidity, despite our ignorance, you have mercy on us. And we're so grateful. We're so grateful that you sent us your Son, not just to show us the way, take us by the hand and lead us there, back into the place of your love, grace and mercy for us, back into the place of relationship with you. Thank you, Holy Spirit, that even in this moment now, you're speaking to different hearts about the stories of their lives and where they're pointing. In your sweet, gentle way, you're calling us back to you. Thank you for your faithfulness, Lord. Thank you for your love. Bless this people this week. May they carry the fragrance of Jesus with them wherever they go. When they meet people, people see them. Let their story affect them so that people would say, I want to go where they're going. I want to have what they have. Jesus, flood your people with your presence as you promised. And we thank you for it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. God bless you.